On the set of The Return of the King, there was a day when an 81-year-old actor stopped Peter Jackson.
To understand why Mortensen responded to Lee the way he did, it helps to understand who Mortensen was before Middle-earth ever entered his life. He was born in Manhattan in 1958, but New York barely factored into his upbringing. His father's work carried the family through Venezuela, Denmark, and Argentina before Mortensen had even started school, and it was Argentina that left the deepest mark. He grew fluent enough in Spanish that it became, functionally, a second mother tongue. When his parents separated, an 11-year-old Mortensen moved back to New York with his mother and siblings, eventually finishing a degree at St. Lawrence University. What followed wasn't a clear path into acting. He spent years moving between countries and odd jobs, restless in a way that resists tidy summary, until a trip back to New York that he thought was for a theater audition turned out, almost by accident, to be an acting class. He stayed. It became a career he hadn't planned for and, by his own account, hadn't especially expected. His screen debut was a minor role in 1985's Witness, opposite Harrison Ford, the kind of part most actors forget they ever played. Mortensen didn't treat it that way. From the beginning, he approached even the smallest, strangest, most disposable roles as though they deserved total physical and emotional commitment. In the low-budget horror film Prison, 2 years later, he insisted on genuine discomfort over the appearance of it, running through freezing water in nothing but underwear rather than fake the cold, because faking it felt like a kind of dishonesty he wasn't willing to practice. Almost nobody noticed. He did it anyway, again and again, through a string of strange and mostly overlooked films across the late 80s and early 90s. A supporting role in a Texas Chainsaw Massacre sequel, a haunting turn in the little scene The Reflecting Skin, and a genuinely unsettling performance as a troubled Vietnam veteran in Sean Penn's directorial debut, The Indian Runner. By the early 90s, critics had started to notice a pattern. A working actor who kept turning in performances far better than the films around him, without ever quite becoming a name people recognized. He appeared alongside Al Pacino in Carlito's Way, took roles in smaller films partly because he needed the money, and slowly built a reputation among directors as someone who disappeared into a part rather than simply playing one. Crimson Tide in 1995 put him in front of a much bigger audience, playing a submarine officer opposite Denzel Washington and Gene Hackman. 2 years later, cast as a Navy SEAL commander in Ridley Scott's G.I. Jane, he spent months talking to real SEALs and deliberately skipped the cast's official training, a choice that left his co-stars genuinely irritated with him on set. That irritation was exactly what he wanted. The character was supposed to be resented, so he made sure he was. The film wasn't a critical success, but once again, it was Mortensen's total commitment to the part that people remembered. By the end of the decade, he had accumulated an unusually rich body of work and almost no public recognition to go with it. He was the actor other actors and directors respected, working steadily in the margins of an industry that hadn't yet figured out where to place him. Then, with very little warning, that changed completely. The production of The Lord of the Rings was already in crisis by the time Mortensen entered the picture. Peter Jackson had originally cast a different actor as Aragorn and spent weeks preparing him for the role, but something wasn't working. The actor resisted rehearsal, showed little interest in the horseback and sword training the part required, and kept insisting things would come together once filming actually began. They didn't. Within days of shooting, Jackson made the difficult decision to recast the role entirely. The search that followed was rushed and increasingly desperate. A couple of well-known names were considered and passed on, either because they weren't famous enough or, in one case, because an actor freshly associated with historical epics didn't want to be typecast again. Mortensen's name arrived almost as a last resort, but it fit in ways the studio hadn't initially considered. He was an experienced horseman, spent much of his free time outdoors, and had a genuine, long-standing interest in European mythology and folklore that made Tolkien's source material feel less like homework and more like familiar territory. Even so, he nearly turned it down. He had a young son, Henry, and the role meant an extended absence in New Zealand at a point in his son's life when leaving didn't sit right with him. By most accounts, it was Henry, already a devoted fan of the books, who tipped the decision, urging his father not to pass up the chance to play a character he loved so much. Mortensen has described making the decision to go largely on that basis, before he'd even finished reading the books himself. He said yes because his son asked him to, and figured out what he'd agreed to along the way. He arrived on set with essentially no preparation time, no established relationships with his co-stars, and no settled understanding of who Aragorn was supposed to be. Jackson has since acknowledged that Mortensen's uncertainty was visible in his earliest scenes, most notably his introduction at the Prancing Pony, filmed only days after he joined the production. Fans and critics who've studied that footage closely have often pointed out something that feels almost too fitting to be accidental. Aragorn, at that point in the story, is a man hiding from his own identity, uneasy with being seen for who he truly is. An actor thrown into the role with no time to build false confidence gave the moment something rawer and more honest than a fully rehearsed performance likely could have. It didn't take long for that uncertainty to burn off. By the confrontation at Weathertop, something in Mortensen's performance had visibly shifted. He'd found the harder, more feral edge underneath Aragorn's nobility, and one of the trilogy's most iconic images, Aragorn swinging a lit torch directly toward camera, came out of pure improvisation in the moment. From there, his commitment became something close to legendary on set. He trained on horseback so extensively that he ended up buying his own horse after filming Wrapped, along with the horse used by Liv Tyler's stunt double, when no one else stepped up to meet the price. He insisted on training and fighting with an actual steel sword rather than a safer stage prop, a habit that occasionally got him strange looks from local police when he practiced off-set. The film's fight choreographer later called him one of the most naturally gifted swordsmen he'd ever worked with. He broke 2 toes in one physical sequence and let the unscripted sound of real pain make it into the final cut. When he chipped a tooth during the Helm's Deep shoot, he reportedly went to see a dentist still in costume and makeup rather than break character continuity. At one point, Jackson spent half an hour in conversation with him, addressing him only as Aragorn, apparently without noticing he'd never once used Mortensen's actual name. It was inside the atmosphere of near-obsessive dedication to authenticity that Mortensen crossed paths with a man who didn't need to manufacture any of it. Christopher Lee was born in 1922 in London to an Italian noblewoman and a British Army officer, and by the time he stepped into the role of Saruman, he had already lived an entire life that most of his younger co-stars knew almost nothing about. He joined the Royal Air Force in 1941 and served throughout the Second World War, eventually rising to the rank of flight lieutenant working in intelligence. He also, by his own occasional and characteristically vague admission, had some involvement with British Special Operations, the kind of work dangerous enough that he would simply stop mid-sentence rather than elaborate. Producer Barry Osgood, who was present for a conversation about one of Lee's death scenes, later said only that Lee had been connected to British intelligence services in some capacity nobody on the production ever fully pinned down, and that Lee clearly preferred it that way. He spoke several languages fluently. He had personally met J.R.R. Tolkien years before the films were ever conceived, making him the only person connected to the production who had actually known the author. By his own account, he reread The Lord of the Rings once a year for most of his adult life, a private habit rather than a publicity talking point. He had, in fact, wanted to play Gandalf. He said as much openly in later interviews. But by the time Jackson was casting, Lee was approaching 80, and the physically demanding writing and combat sequences required for Gandalf were more than his body could reliably manage. Saruman asked less of him physically, and he took the role that fit, then poured everything he had left into it. The pairing of these two men, an 80-something war veteran who had personally known Tolkien, and a 40-something actor who refused a rubber sword because it felt dishonest, produced something quieter than either of their public personas suggested. Between takes, while much of the rest of the cast socialized or played cards, Mortensen and Lee would find a corner and talk, sometimes switching between German, Spanish, and even Old Norse, languages both men had studied not for the film, but because they'd simply always wanted to. Their conversations reportedly circled back again and again to the mythological traditions Tolkien had drawn from, rather than anything to do with the industry around them. Lee seemed to recognize in Mortensen something he didn't often find in younger collaborators, someone who approached the material as something closer to inheritance than entertainment. Lee also noticed the sword. Watching Mortensen train relentlessly with a heavy steel blade forged specifically for the production, Lee, who had performed an enormous number of screen sword fights across his career and trained extensively in stage combat, reportedly remarked to the film cinematographer that Mortensen had a natural physical instinct for combat that couldn't simply be taught. For Mortensen, a compliment like that from Christopher Lee carried far more weight than ordinary praise. It felt less like flattery and more like a verdict from the one person on set who was actually qualified to give one. Perhaps the most talked about moment between them involves the filming of Saruman's death. Jackson initially directed Lee to deliver a loud scream as the character is stabbed from behind. Lee stopped him and explained, calmly and without hesitation, why that wasn't right. He had, at some point in his past, heard exactly what a man sounds like when a blade goes into his back, and the honest sound isn't a scream at all. It's a single, forced, choked exhale, because the body simply doesn't allow for anything more theatrical in that instant. Jackson, to his credit, didn't argue. He let Lee play the moment the way Lee knew, from direct experience. It actually happened. Mortensen has spoken since about what it meant to be near that kind of knowledge. Not research, not preparation, but lived fact. He's described it as a weight no acting class could replicate. Standing next to someone who had genuinely lived through violence while making a fantasy film about violence. Someone who could instinctively tell the difference between what looked dramatic and what was simply true. For an actor who had spent his career trying to close that exact gap through sheer physical effort, watching Lee possess it naturally was, in Mortensen's telling, its own kind of education. There was gentler common ground between them too. Despite decades of playing villains, Dracula across numerous films, a Bond antagonist, and now Saruman, Lee had a surprisingly tender artistic streak. He sang seriously and had recorded opera earlier in his life, and would go on, well into his 80s, to record heavy metal albums simply because the idea entertained him. Mortensen, who founded a small independent publishing house, Perceval Press, specifically to support poetry, photography, and music the mainstream industry had no interest in, recognized something familiar in that. Two men who had built very different, very public reputations, while quietly protecting creative work that had little to do with fame and everything to do with who they actually were. Christopher Lee died in June 2015 in London, just over a week past his 93rd birthday. Peter Jackson wrote afterward about visiting Lee and his wife Git, married more than 5 decades by then, describing it as one of the genuine pleasures of his own life. Hours spent hearing stories he knew he'd never get to hear in full. In the years following The Lord of the Rings, Mortensen did roughly what anyone paying attention to his earlier career should have expected. He didn't cash in. He turned down a string of franchise offers he considered predictable and thin, and chose not to return as Aragorn for The Hobbit, since the character had no real place in that story, and forcing him back and would have meant exactly the kind of compromise he'd spent decades avoiding. Instead, he kept chasing difficult, specific, occasionally uncomfortable work. In 2005, he made a history of violence with David Cronenberg, the first of 4 films the two would make together, and has called it among the best work of his career. 2 years later came Eastern Promises, in which he played a Russian mob enforcer with such thoroughness that he traveled through Russia without a translator, studied prison tattoo culture in detail, and kept Russian television running in his hotel room purely to internalize the accent. The role brought him his first Academy Award nomination. He kept choosing hard over easy. For 2009's The Road, adapting Cormac McCarthy's bleak post-apocalyptic novel, he lost a significant amount of weight and stayed in his character's filthy costume between takes, at one point reportedly being mistaken for an actual homeless man during filming. Captain Fantastic in 2016 earned him a second Oscar nomination for playing an unconventional father raising 6 children off the grid. Then, in 2018, came Green Book, in which he went the opposite direction entirely, gaining substantial weight to play Tony Lip, the real-life driver who chauffeured pianist Don Shirley through the segregated American South in 1962, eating heartily and visibly in nearly every food scene rather than fake it, because the real man had eaten that way. The film won Best Picture, and Mortensen earned a 3rd Oscar nomination. None of this happened because Mortensen needed validation. He already had Aragorn, a role that could have supported an entire career of comfortable, well-paid sequels and spin-offs. He chose the harder path instead, the same instinct for uncompromising truth that Christopher Lee had modeled for him on a New Zealand film set decades earlier. The conviction that getting a thing right matters more than getting it easy. When Mortensen talks about Lee now, it isn't with the casual fondness reserved for a former co-star. It's closer to how someone describes a person who altered the direction of their thinking without ever setting out to teach them anything. Aragorn, in the story, carries an almost unbearable reverence for the kings who came before him, men whose sacrifices shaped a world he inherited without fully understanding until he'd lived inside it himself. Knowing what stood a few feet away from Mortensen between takes, it isn't hard to see where some of that came from. He didn't need to imagine it. The person embodying it was right there, speaking quietly in a language most of the crew didn't recognize, carrying memories he only ever shared in fragments. Mortensen never let The Lord of the Rings become the high point of his career, the way it might have for almost anyone else handed that kind of role. But of everything the trilogy gave him, the horses, the sword he still owns, the career that followed, what he keeps returning to, now in his late 60s, is the memory of an old man in a wizard's robe who knew, from experience nobody should have to earn, exactly what it sounds like when someone is stabbed in the back, and who was generous enough to share what he knew with the one younger actor on set paying close enough attention to receive it.